Dr. Bill Linder groaned as he dragged a suitcase up the stairs of his house in Columbus, Ohio. It was June of 1990, and the 43-year-old doctor had just returned from a family trip to Israel with his 2 teenage daughters. The vacation had gone smoothly until one of their relatives got seriously ill. Bill's wife stayed behind to care for their family member while Bill and the kids returned back home. As he struggled to get his heavy luggage up each step, Bill could hear his daughters, 15-year-old Jocelyn and 16-year-old Hillary, running down to the basement to watch a movie. He couldn't believe they could keep their eyes open. After a 2-week trip, an international flight, and a long drive home from the airport, he felt exhausted. When he finally reached the upper landing, Bill headed straight to his room and collapsed into bed. But as soon as he took off his socks, he noticed his ankles looked swollen. Bill wondered if he'd accidentally injured his ankles by walking too much on vacation, but when he felt around the joints for sore spots, they didn't hurt. So Bill figured the swelling must be a result of too much sitting during the long international flight. Bill stood up and walked into his bathroom and grabbed a bottle of diuretic pills out of his medicine cabinet. He took one, hoping it might reduce the fluid buildup in his body. Then Bill crawled back into bed, desperate for a nap. Less than an hour later, Bill woke up. He still felt tired, but it was getting close to dinner time, and he knew his daughters needed to eat. So he threw the covers back and got out of bed. Bill walked out of his bedroom, intending to walk down to the kitchen, but as he stood at the top of the stairs, he started to feel lightheaded. His vision went blurry and his ears began to ring. He reached out to grab the stair railing for support, but he missed, and instead of catching himself, he fell face first into the metal rail. For a moment, everything went black. Then Bill heard Jocelyn and Hillary running up the stairs, followed by their frantic voices asking if he was okay. Bill slowly opened his eyes. He realized he was lying at the top of the stairs, and he felt this warm, wet liquid dripping down his temple. He touched the side of his head, and when he looked at his fingers, he saw they were covered in blood. He turned to his side and saw both of his daughters staring at him, their eyes wide with terror. Bill slowly stood up, holding onto the railing this time, and promised Jocelyn and Hillary that he was okay. His head was just throbbing from hitting the railing, but other than that, he felt okay. He said he must have just gotten up too fast. The girls insisted on taking Bill to see one of the doctors at his family practice. Bill didn't want to leave the house, but he figured if a quick checkup would put his daughters' minds at ease, then it was worth it. When they got to the family clinic a few minutes later, Bill could tell his colleagues were shocked to see him with dried blood caked onto his cheek. Luckily, the visit was short. The physician on duty cleaned Bill up, gave him 7 stitches, and then just sent him home. 2 years later, in the summer of 1992, Bill and his favorite nurse, whose name was Kim, were closing up the family clinic for the day. Bill had not had any more health scares since his fall 2 years earlier, so in that time, he'd just been focusing on spending time with his family and continuing to expand his medical practice. Though it was getting close to dinner time, Bill did not need to rush home. His wife Rhoda was out of town, and the girls were going out with their friends. So he and Kim took their time wiping down countertops and restocking the exam rooms, chatting and drinking a couple of beers that Bill had stashed in the office refrigerator. Bill and Kim finally headed out to the parking lot at about 7 p.m. And as the two of them walked across the concrete, Bill suddenly started to feel short of breath. He'd only gone a few dozen yards, but he felt like he'd just sprinted a mile. He stood still and tried to stop panting, but inhaling just kept getting harder and harder. Kim put her hand on his shoulder and gave him a very concerned look. Bill turned to her and just said, "I need to go to the hospital." Kim sped Bill to the nearest emergency room, and when they got there, Kim helped Bill shuffle up to the front desk. In between labored breaths, he told the receptionist that he could barely breathe, but since he was a doctor, he knew what he needed. He asked to have a chest x-ray as soon as possible. Less than an hour later, Bill was lying on a hard bed in a hospital room, still struggling to inhale while Kim coached him through each breath. Finally, a radiologist entered the room with the x-ray results, and Kim helped Bill sit up so he could see. But what Bill saw on the x-ray film seemed impossible. Normally, lungs appear dark on an x-ray, but Bill's looked white. Now, Bill was not a lung specialist, but he'd known since medical school that this was a sign of fluid building up around the lungs. In severe cases, there can be so much liquid in the chest cavity, the lungs can't inflate properly, making it difficult or even impossible to breathe. Looking at the x-ray, Bill felt genuinely frightened. Now he understood why he was so short of breath. But what he didn't understand was why all this fluid was building up in the first place. It usually only occurred in patients who were elderly or extremely sick with things like pneumonia or cancer. Bill was 45 years old and careful about his health. He watched what he ate, exercised every day. He had no chronic illnesses, and so this just didn't make sense. Bill asked the radiologist what could be causing this, and the young woman said she didn't know. They would need to run tests to find the source of the fluid. Right now, the best thing they could do was just drain the liquid out of his chest cavity using a procedure called tapping. Bill dreaded the sound of that word. He knew exactly what tapping was, but he had never thought he'd have to experience it himself. It was a crude, unpleasant procedure, and the worst part was, Bill would be wide awake for the entire thing. Half an hour later, Bill was sitting shirtless on the edge of his hospital bed while the attending physician sat on a stool beside him. She disinfected Bill's back, then injected a local anesthetic near the rear of his rib cage. Bill's back quickly went numb, but that did not make him feel any less afraid, and so he reached out for Kim, who was still there to support him. Bill wanted to close his eyes for the next part, but he was too terrified to look away. He watched as the physician brought a long, thick needle towards his back. Then he felt a dull pressure as she plunged this needle between his ribs and pushed it deep into the space surrounding his lungs. Then the attending physician attached the opposite end of this needle to a thin tube, which led to a clear plastic container. As Bill squeezed Kim's hand and tried to relax, liquid began to drain out of his chest. Bill hoped the liquid would be clear or tan, because those were the most common colors of fluid in the chest cavity, and he didn't want to see any red tint, which could mean he was bleeding internally. But the fluid Bill saw coming out of his back and going up this tube was not clear, tan, or red. It was a thick, milky, yellowy substance that reminded him of the filling inside of a lemon meringue pie. He sat there watching this weird, gross liquid flow through the tube until an entire liter had been drained from the area surrounding his lungs. Finally, Bill felt a dull ache as the attending physician removed the needle and then covered the puncture hole with a bandage. Bill released his grip on Kim's hand and then asked the attending physician, what just came out of my body? What was that? She told him that the thick, milky fluid he was seeing was known as chyle, which is a mixture that includes fluids from the body's immune system. When a person has an infection, these fluids will flood the infected area, but they normally disappear after the infection is gone. The doctor told Bill that his body was not draining these fluids correctly, and it was causing a fluid buildup known as lymphedema. Now that Bill thought about it, lymphedema could explain the swelling problems that he had been experiencing for years. He'd thought that his badly swollen ankles a couple of years ago were caused by the long flight home from Israel, but now he realized it could be from something much worse. Because it wasn't just swelling in his legs and ankles. His body was leaking fluids into the space around his lungs, which was really baffling. His doctor agreed that chyle should never leak into the body like this. She said she had only ever seen that happen in cases of liver failure, certain cancers, and in heart disease. When the doctor mentioned heart disease, Bill remembered something. As a child, he'd been diagnosed with a heart murmur, a tiny sound that indicated a serious problem with his heart. Bill had undergone open heart surgery to correct the murmur when he was just 12 years old. Since the operation, Bill had not had any cardiac problems, but now he wondered, could his childhood illness be connected to the symptoms he was experiencing as an adult? The physician said it was possible, but she also told him not to panic. They wouldn't be able to determine exactly what was happening until he underwent a series of tests. Until then, he should just stay calm and not jump to any conclusions. Bill promised he would try, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his heart could be failing him. Over a year later, in 1994, Bill held onto his wife's arms as she slowly lowered him into the bathtub inside their room at a Boston hotel where they had been staying for months. They were visiting the doctors who had treated Bill's heart as a child, plus many more specialists throughout the city. They were hoping to find someone who'd be able to make sense of Bill's bizarre symptoms. While Bill's wife, Rhoda, scrubbed his aching back with a sponge, Bill thought about all the tests he'd undergone. Multiple cardiologists had examined his heart, and they had all said the same thing, that it was functioning totally normally. So whatever was happening to him, it couldn't have anything to do with his heart or with the surgery he'd undergone as a child. There was also nothing wrong with his kidneys or his liver or his immune system. What's more, he didn't appear to have cancer. Based on the test results, Bill should have been perfectly healthy. But he wasn't. The space around his lungs continued to fill with chyle, making every breath a struggle. His back was scarred from repeated tapping procedures to drain the fluid. Bill looked down at his stomach, which had become round and hard as a rock. This was a relatively new symptom, but it bothered him the most. Doctors told him that his stomach, his gut, was also filling up with chyle, which was even more worrisome than what was happening with his lungs. There were other alarming developments too. When Bill ate, the protein and fat in his food was not being processed correctly. Instead, it was leaking out of his intestines and mixing with his blood and other fluids. These were the ingredients in the chyle that kept building up inside of his body. As a doctor himself, Bill knew how serious this was. It meant that his body was not getting the nutrients it needed. With his wife's help, Bill climbed out of the bath, put on his pajamas, and got into bed. He closed his eyes, feeling absolutely miserable, and did his best to sleep. A few hours later, Bill woke up shivering and covered in sweat. He knew he must have a fever, so he shook his wife's shoulder to wake her up. Rhoda took one look at him and said they needed to go to the hospital right now. Bill held onto his wife as she helped him hobble out to the car, and then before he knew it, they were already at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. Bill was too feverish and confused to check in, so he collapsed into a waiting room chair while his wife spoke with the receptionist. A few minutes later, a nurse brought Bill a wheelchair and wheeled him down the hall. By the time they made it to the examination room, Bill could barely speak and his vision was blurry. He was vaguely aware of a doctor coming in to examine him, and then he heard that doctor say that Bill would need to go to the intensive care unit. Bill turned his head to the side. Through the haze of his vision, he could see his wife anxiously holding her hands in front of her chest. He tried to wave to her as if to tell her everything is going to be okay, but he was too weak to even lift his hand. Early the next morning, one of Bill and Rhoda's daughters, Jocelyn, walked through the large glass doors of Brigham and Women's Hospital. Jocelyn was now 19 years old and a college student right here in the Boston area. She'd been up very late the night before, but the moment her mom called her and told her that her dad was in the hospital, she'd gotten out of bed early and driven straight here from her dorm room. Despite her exhaustion, Jocelyn's nerves had her all wound up. She couldn't stop thinking about her father's illness, and she constantly felt anxious. She'd been skipping classes lately and partying too much, doing her best to distract herself from her dad's problems. When Jocelyn walked inside of her father's room, she saw her dad lying on the hospital bed with tubes coming out of his arms, and it made her feel even worse. He looked old and frail. She gave him a gentle hug and then sat down on the couch next to her mom and her older sister. Jocelyn's mother explained to her that her father had contracted a staph infection, which is a dangerous type of bacterial infection in the blood. He had likely gotten it during one of his many tests or fluid draining procedures. Jocelyn sighed. Her dad was already so sick, and this felt like one more health problem to add to the list. It felt like they were all just kind of waiting around powerlessly, praying for something to change. Just then, Jocelyn heard the door to the room creak open, and in walked her great-aunt, whose name was Joni. Joni lived in New York, and so the family did not see her much. But Joni skipped past the usual greetings, and instead she walked right up to Bill's hospital bed and held out a dusty 3-ring binder. Joni said she knew what was wrong with Bill. She said that she had seen all of his symptoms before in her own husband, Bill's uncle. All the proof was right here in the binder she had brought. Jocelyn nearly jumped out of her seat. Maybe Joni really was carrying the breakthrough the family had been hoping for. Jocelyn assumed her father would be excited too, but he immediately waved Joni off. He told her that the two cases were not similar at all, and so he didn't want to hear anything else about his Uncle Nathan. Confused, Jocelyn pulled her great-aunt out of the room and into the hallway and asked to look at the binder. Jocelyn realized these were her great-uncle's medical records. Nathan had died over 30 years earlier in 1961, and these documents detailed the illness that killed him. Jocelyn's great-uncle Nathan had suffered from lymphedema, or swelling, in his ankles, just like Jocelyn's father. Doctors also reported heavy chyle buildup in Nathan's chest and abdomen that needed to be drained repeatedly from his body. He'd even been diagnosed with a heart murmur. To Jocelyn, it did all sound very similar to her father's condition. When Jocelyn looked back up at her great-aunt, Joni seemed kind of apologetic. She said her husband Nathan had died a very long and painful death, and so she assumed that Bill refused to believe he might have the same condition because he couldn't bear to imagine dying the same way. Jocelyn nodded somberly, but inside, she was thinking that this information could be the key to actually helping her father. She told her great aunt they needed to show these records to her father's doctors right away. The same day that Bill was admitted to the ICU, Dr. Christine Seidman was eating lunch in her office at Brigham and Women's Hospital. As she ate a forkful of leftovers, another doctor came inside and placed a 3-ring binder on her desk. They said it had to do with an ICU patient named Dr. Bill Linder. Dr. Seidman swallowed her food and then tucked her short black hair behind her ears. She looked over the documents while her colleague briefed her on Bill's condition. They explained the striking similarities between Bill's symptoms and his uncle's. Dr. Seidman immediately knew this case was right up her alley. In addition to being a cardiologist, she was a geneticist. Dr. Seidman knew that if anyone could solve this mystery illness, it was her. She jumped up from her desk and headed to the ICU. A few months later, in early 1995, Jocelyn sat on an exam table in the Brigham and Women's Hospital as Dr. Seidman rubbed cold gel across her skin and then pressed an ultrasound scanner against Jocelyn's chest. Dr. Seidman was performing something called an echocardiogram, or an ultrasound scan of Jocelyn's heart. The pressure of the plastic scanner hurt, but Jocelyn was too anxious about what the scan might reveal to worry about the pain. Ever since Dr. Seidman began looking into Bill's illness, she had been working closely with Jocelyn and the rest of the Linder family. Her goal was obviously to cure Bill, but to do that, she first had to identify his condition. She'd interviewed the Linder family and collected medical records going back generations, and she'd kept Jocelyn up to date on all her research, which was why Jocelyn knew how important this scan was. Dr. Seidman found that Jocelyn's father and great-uncle were not the only ones who suffered from this mystery illness. Jocelyn's great-grandmother, May, had had it too. The disease appeared to be hereditary, which meant it was getting passed down generation to generation. When Dr. Seidman had called Jocelyn in for this appointment, she explained that all 3 of Jocelyn's relatives who had dealt with this mystery illness, so her dad, great-uncle, and great-grandmother, had the same symptom first: a heart murmur. The doctors who had been treating Bill until now thought his childhood heart condition was totally irrelevant. But Dr. Seidman had discovered that it was actually the telltale sign of the mystery family disease. Jocelyn watched Dr. Seidman stare intently at the ultrasound screen. Then the doctor turned to Jocelyn, and with a pained expression on her face, she said Jocelyn did have a heart murmur. It was not a guarantee that Jocelyn would eventually develop the family disease, but there was now a very strong chance that she could. Jocelyn imagined her own body filling up with all that chyle the way her father's was, and tears began to well up in her eyes as she watched the black and white image of her heart beating on the screen. Normally, a heartbeat was a sign of life, but to Jocelyn, her heartbeat looked like a death sentence. Almost a year later, near the end of 1995, Bill sat inside of a room at the Ohio Doctors Hospital in Columbus. His condition had only gotten worse, and because doctors in Boston had not been able to help him, he and his wife Rhoda decided to go back home to Columbus. However, even though they were now closer to their house, Bill rarely spent a night in his own bed. He was almost always in one hospital or another. That day, Bill was hooked up to an IV that pumped vitamins and minerals into his bloodstream. His mystery illness had been stealing proteins and fats from his digestive system for almost 3 years, and so he now had to have this injection of nutrients twice a day in order to get the nutrients he needed. Bill looked down at his scab-covered arms from all the needles, his swollen ankles, and his huge, rounded stomach. He was in the worst shape of his life, physically and mentally. Bill knew that Dr. Seidman was trying to identify his illness and find a cure, and he had held out hope that she would. But now, he was just worried about the rest of his family. Dr. Seidman had told Bill that a total of 13 people in his family were likely to develop this disease, including both of his daughters. Now, Bill didn't only have to deal with his own horrible and confusing illness, he also had to deal with the knowledge that he might have passed it on to both of his kids. Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and a tall man with gray hair and a clean-shaven face entered. He introduced himself as Dr. Larry Lynn. Dr. Lynn sat down beside Bill's bed. He explained that he was a pulmonologist, or a lung expert, but more than that, he was obsessed with medical mysteries. He told Bill that he spent his free time digging through the hospital's records for inexplicable cases, and he'd happened upon Bill's file. Bill was skeptical. He asked Dr. Lin how many medical mysteries he'd been able to actually solve so far, and with a smirk, Dr. Lin replied, "Every single one." For the first time in months, Bill smiled. About 3 months later, in the spring of 1996, Bill, along with his wife Rhoda and his daughters Jocelyn and Hillary, were all clustered together on the couch in Bill's room at the Ohio Doctors Hospital. Bill looked out his window at the Columbus skyline, and he inhaled deeply. He was breathing better than he had in years, and the scabs on his arms were finally beginning to heal. He felt healthy enough to get out of bed and sit with his family and carry on an actual conversation. Bill knew these improvements were all thanks to Dr. Lin. When he began treating Bill, one of the first things Dr. Lin suggested was a new diet. The chyle leaking into his abdomen contained fats and proteins, so Dr. Lin told him he would need to eat a fat-free, low-protein diet. Dr. Lin's hope was this would make his body produce less chyle. It had only taken a few weeks on this new diet for Bill to start to feel a difference. His gut was still hard and rounded, but he could now breathe better. And he also did not have to have the fluids drained from his chest as often. Bill breathed out and told his wife and children that soon enough, he'd be healthy enough to go for a walk downtown. And as he dreamed about leaving the hospital for good, there was a knock at the door. Dr. Lin came inside and told the family he had a big announcement. He had solved Bill's medical mystery. Bill and his family all sat up, anxious to hear what the doctor had to say. Dr. Lin said he'd been investigating Bill's illness using a brand new tool called the Internet. He'd spent hours searching for people with symptoms similar to Bill's, and eventually he found a family in Turkey with a condition that seemed identical. They'd been diagnosed with a rare disorder called Behçet's disease. Behçet's disease causes blood vessels throughout the body to swell. This leads to bodily fluids like blood and lymph not being able to circulate properly. And one potential symptom is lymphedema, just like Bill and his relatives had experienced. Bill couldn't believe it. He asked the doctor what this diagnosis meant. Was his disease treatable? Would he and his daughters be okay? Dr. Lin nodded. He said that while Behçet's disease was rare and poorly understood, the treatment couldn't be simpler. All Bill needed were steroid injections, and he'd be good as new. Bill jumped out of his hospital bed, an IV still attached to one arm. He threw his arms around his daughters, he kissed his wife over and over, and he let tears of joy roll down his cheeks. Finally, he was going to be okay again. The following night, Bill was lying in his hospital bed, looking at the dark sky through his window. Dr. Lin had given him a steroid injection, and he felt hopeful that the treatment would work. But suddenly, Bill felt a sharp pain in his chest, and the whole room went black. 2 days later, Bill woke up. The light in his hospital room seemed blindingly bright. As his vision focused, he saw Dr. Lin standing at the foot of his bed. The doctor's eyebrows were knitted together, and his lips were pressed into a frown. The doctor told Bill he'd gone into cardiac arrest. The hospital had been able to resuscitate him, but the emergency made one thing clear. Dr. Lin had been wrong. Bill did not have Behçet's disease, and steroids were not going to cure him. If anything, they could have made his condition worse. Bill was stunned. He'd almost died, and now he was also back to square one with a mystery disease that no one knew how to treat that also might kill him. In that moment, he suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of absolute hopelessness. 6 months later, in September of 1996, Bill's daughter Jocelyn was writing on a yellow pad working on a term paper. After spending her early college years partying and skipping class, she was now committed to getting her life together and finishing her degree. Plus, focusing on school helped her ignore the things that made her the most anxious, the knowledge that she might one day develop the same disease that was killing her father. As she scrawled on her paper, Jocelyn's phone rang. She picked it up, and she heard her mother's strained voice on the other end. She said Jocelyn's father had been placed into a medically induced coma. Jocelyn's mother explained that doctors were no longer able to drain that chyle from her father's chest and abdomen. He just had way too much scar tissue built up from years of undergoing the tapping procedure. And so now the fluid buildup was putting immense pressure on his internal organs, and they were failing one by one. Jocelyn felt tears building in the corner of her eyes. She asked her mom if this meant her father was going to die. After a moment, her mother said yes. Jocelyn swallowed hard. Her father had never lost hope that his doctors would be able to identify his condition and find a cure, but they didn't. Jocelyn wanted to start sobbing, but she did know there was one hidden blessing. Her father's suffering would finally be over. And sure enough, just a few days later, on September 25th, Bill would die. Seven years later, in 2003, 28-year-old Jocelyn was walking towards the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, California. After her father passed away in September of 1996, Jocelyn had moved far away to California, but the trauma of her father's slow, painful decline followed her wherever she went. She was acutely aware that she might meet the same fate. It was also very hard for Jocelyn to forget that she had not been there during her father's last moments. She'd flown to Columbus and gone to the hospital, but when her dad actually drew his last breath, Jocelyn had been outside smoking a cigarette. Jocelyn had a lot of regrets and painful memories. The only thing that brought her any real solace were these long walks, when she could breathe in the summer air and organize her thoughts. Jocelyn found a nice spot to sit on the bridge where she could look through the red bars to the sparkling water down below. She crossed her legs, and as she did, she noticed that one of her ankles looked much larger than the other. It had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Jocelyn remembered how her father's legs and ankles began to swell just a few years before he got really sick, but she tried not to panic. She told herself that her ankle was just aggravated from the long walk, and so she went back home that day, and sure enough, the swelling went down. But a few days later, she was at her apartment getting ready to go on another walk, and her foot and ankle were so swollen that she couldn't even get her shoe on. Jocelyn knew she could not ignore the swelling any longer, so she went to her small desk, turned on her computer, and opened up her email. She typed in Dr. Christine Seidman's address and wrote her a message asking if she should be worried about the swelling in her legs. Jocelyn finally got a response the next day. Dr. Seidman didn't say whether or not she should be worried. Instead, she offered to fly Jocelyn out to her lab near Boston. She said that in the 7 years since Jocelyn's father had passed away, she had not stopped researching her family's mystery illness, and she'd recently made a breakthrough that she wanted to tell Jocelyn about in person. The idea of going back to Boston made Jocelyn feel really nervous. She hadn't been there since her dad died. But this was very important, and so she responded to Dr. Seidman with a yes, and immediately began packing her bags. A few days later, Jocelyn walked into the tall red brick building that housed the Seidman Laboratory. She went inside and introduced herself to one of Dr. Seidman's research assistants, a young, dark-haired woman. As soon as Jocelyn said her name, the research assistant beamed. She told Jocelyn that she was so excited to see her. Jocelyn was really taken aback. She didn't even realize that the researchers would know who she was. Just then, Dr. Seidman rounded a corner and said hello, looking happier than Jocelyn had ever seen her before. Jocelyn followed her into the back of the lab, trailed by the cheerful assistant, and they all sat down in the cluttered room while Jocelyn looked back and forth at the two women, a little uneasy at how excited they both seemed. Before she could even ask what was going on, Dr. Seidman told her. She and her team had used a technology that had only just been developed, and at last, they had found the cause of her family's mysterious disease. Dr. Seidman had been painstakingly creating a map of Bill Linder's genes so that she could find anything that looked out of the ordinary. But there are hundreds of thousands of genes in every individual person, and Dr. Seidman had to build her map one by one. That's why her research had taken so long. But finally, they'd found an extremely rare mutation of a single gene that had caused Bill's illness. It was a lot like finding a needle in a haystack. The chances of a single defective gene leading to such a debilitating illness were about 1 in a billion. Even more surprisingly, Dr. Seidman concluded that no one in the world outside of the Linder family carried this mutation. Dr. Seidman discovered that the genetic mutation began with Jocelyn's great-great-grandmother, Esther, who first showed symptoms of the disease roughly 100 years earlier. That made Esther what disease trackers call patient zero, the first patient with a brand new disease. Since Esther, this mysterious condition had been passed down 5 generations. Once Dr. Seidman found this genetic defect, suddenly Bill's illness made more sense. The mutation stopped his liver from being able to properly filter toxins out of his blood, and from there, it caused a cascade of serious problems, including the chronic swelling and the chyle buildup in his chest and abdomen. Lastly, the genetic mutation also appeared to cause the family's telltale heart murmur. Jocelyn was on the edge of her seat as she heard all this. She asked Dr. Seidman if now they'd be able to cure her, her sister, and her other relatives who had likely inherited this disease. But Dr. Seidman shook her head sadly. She said while this was a huge discovery, many questions still remained. I mean, at this point, they didn't even have a name for this disease, and so they really had no way to treat or cure it, at least not yet. Jocelyn felt totally deflated. Even though they had just figured out what was behind the family's deadly illness, there was nothing she could do about it. Over the last 20 years, Jocelyn has come to terms with her diagnosis. Because the risk of passing on her deadly genetic variant was so high, Jocelyn and her husband chose not to have kids. Her older sister Hillary opted to use a form of in vitro fertilization that allowed her to have twins who were both free from the family disease. Right now, in the 6th and newest generation of the Linder family, there are 23 children. But due to advances in fertility treatment, none of these new generation kids have the genetic mutation. The Linders were able to stop the spread of their family illness. Today, there are 7 members of the Linder family who do carry the genetic mutation who are still alive. Dr. Seidman and her team continue to research their illness in hopes of someday finding a cure. On the night of October 12, 1984, 20-year-old Angela Samoda eagerly picked up her telephone and dialed her boyfriend's number. But after he picked up and they spoke for just a few minutes, Angela's smile on her face faded quickly, and while she didn't exactly slam the phone receiver back onto its cradle, she did put it down with more force than she needed to. Angela actually really liked her boyfriend, and even now, after 10 months of dating, her heart beat faster whenever she thought of him. Handsome Ben McCall, already a few years out of college and already a construction project supervisor. But still, Angela couldn't help feeling really disappointed that he had just said no to her invitation to go out with her that night. Angela knew Ben had to be at work very early the next morning, but it wasn't exactly a common occurrence for her to ask him to do things like this, because most Friday nights and Saturday and Sunday nights, Angela was cooped up in her off-campus condo studying. Angela was a third-year student at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and she was enrolled as a double major in the school's highly competitive electrical engineering and computer science programs. Her goal was to use her degree to break into the heavily male-dominated world of engineering. And to ensure her dream became a reality, she had decided early on in her collegiate career to always put academics ahead of her social life. However, this did not mean Angela lacked a social life or that she was an antisocial person. Quite the opposite, in fact. Even though she lived off campus, Angela was the social chairperson of her college sorority. A sorority is a women's organization on a college campus whose purpose is to create a sense of community and friendship. And she was known among her big circle of friends not only for her intelligence and academic achievements, but also for her cheerful attitude and great sense of humor. Within her sorority, Angela was also known for always taking the time to regularly check in with her sorority sisters, chatting, asking how things were going, whether there was anything she could do to help people out. Angela was also strikingly beautiful. She was about 5 feet 4 inches tall with a slender build. She had dark blonde, thick hair, blue eyes, a radiant smile, and she always looked fit and athletic. Angela was actually so attractive that not long ago, it had created a very uncomfortable situation for her. One of her admirers, a fellow college student, had begun just shamelessly following her around campus and leaving notes on her car windshield saying that he wanted to be part of her life. But in truth, that situation had actually worried Angela's sorority sisters much more than it worried Angela, because Angela just had a lot of faith in her own ability to take care of herself. Now, as Angela stood in her kitchen and wrapped her fingers on the counter next to the telephone, she suddenly decided she would just give her boyfriend one more call. Maybe she could change his mind about going out that night. After all, this was not just any Friday night. This was the day before one of the biggest sporting events in Texas. It was the annual rivalry game between the University of Texas and the University of Oklahoma. And it was being played right there in Dallas at the world-famous Cotton Bowl Stadium at the world-famous Texas State Fair. That night in Dallas, thousands of people, college students, alumni, residents, and tourists, would be out in force, enjoying the state fair, packing the local bars and nightclubs and restaurants, and gearing up for the next day's big game. But as Angela went to reach for the phone to call Ben back, she stopped herself and sighed. She knew Ben was not about to change his mind. During their call, Angela had told him that her friend, Anita Kadala, was going to be going out with them that night, meaning Ben knew he could turn down Angela's offer, and Angela would not be left stranded for the night. She would have Anita to still go out with. Also on their call, Angela had even pulled out the big guns and tried to make Ben a little jealous to see if maybe that would convince him to go. She had told him that if he was going to stay in, then maybe she would just give Russell a call to see if he wanted to tag along with her and Anita for the night. Russell was really just a friend, but he was a male friend. However, Ben had not been fazed and had just said, "Okay, sounds good, have fun." After sitting there for a moment, feeling totally annoyed and dejected, Angela suddenly sat up and thought, you know what, I will call Russell and see if he wants to go. So she went to her bedroom desk and rummaged around for the notebook where she kept her phone numbers. Once she found it, she turned to the Bees page, and there it was, Russell Buchanan. Russell, who was 23 years old, had graduated a year earlier from Texas A&M's School of Architecture, but Angela hoped that he still liked going to college parties and sporting events. Angela had met Russell during his senior year at a happy hour one night with a group of mutual friends. Russell had immediately been attracted to Angela and had asked for her phone number. They exchanged information, and a few days later, Russell had called Angela and invited her out to lunch. Angela had said yes, but later wound up canceling on Russell, and so they never actually went out on a date. With her phone book in hand, Angela walked back to her kitchen, picked up the telephone, and dialed Russell's number. Even if he wound up not wanting to go, at least this way, Angela could apologize for canceling on him on that one date. But when Russell picked up, he was all in on the idea of going out with Angela and Anita, and so he agreed to meet the girls later that evening. Not long after speaking to Russell, Anita arrived at Angela's condo, and after doing a little bit of studying and taking a quick nap, the girls began getting ready for the night. Before she and Anita left the condo, Angela took one last look at herself in the mirror. She was wearing one of her favorite outfits. It was a black silk jumpsuit with an open back and a pair of black high heels. She knew she looked her very best, but once again, she found herself wishing that it was Ben she was going out with. Turning away from her reflection, Angela picked up her black purse, she grabbed her car keys, and then she and Anita left the second-floor corner condo at 4944 Amesbury Drive. They headed down to the parking lot and hopped into Angela's Toyota Supra car. Angela was not a big drinker and had volunteered to drive them around that night. Angela turned on the car, she put it in drive, and then the two women drove the short distance to Russell's nearby apartment. After Russell climbed in the car around 9:30 p.m., the trio headed 10 miles south to their first stop of the evening, Bennigan's, a local bar known for its steak and ale. But Bennigan's was just a warm-up. By 11:30 p.m., Angela, Anita, and Russell had made their way first to the Boardwalk Beach Club, a singles bar that was popular for its 1950s and 60s style music, and then on to a nightclub in downtown Dallas called Nostromo's. Shortly after they arrived there, Angela, who now missed her boyfriend even more than she had before she left, decided she would just give him another call and see if maybe now he would want to join them. But after being awakened from his sleep, Ben was not any more inclined to come out and meet Angela. However, since Ben was a member of the club where they were at, Nostromo's, he called the front desk and got Angela and her friends access to their exclusive Rio room, which was the back room of the club. Angela still wished she could just have Ben, but the Rio room was a pretty good consolation prize. And so Angela spent the next hour or so dancing inside of this VIP area with Russell and Anita, and then when she wasn't dancing, she was walking from table to table saying hello to all the folks who were in there. According to Anita, it seemed like Angela knew literally everyone at the club that night. By 12:30 a.m., Angela was feeling tired, so she flagged down Anita and Russell and signaled that she wanted to leave. Angela had plans to get up early the next day and actually leave Dallas before the big crowds descended on the Cotton Bowl Stadium. She wasn't going to stick around for the big Texas versus Oklahoma game. Instead, she and some of her sorority sisters had decided to drive 100 miles south to Waco, Texas, to watch the football game between their own school, Southern Methodist University, and Baylor University. When Angela, Anita, and Russell left Nostromos and stepped back out onto the street, the crowd outside, and really all around Dallas, was just as thick and rowdy as it had been earlier in the evening. The three friends made their way through the crowd to Angela's car that was parked in the outdoor lot across the street, and then about 15 minutes later, Angela pulled up in front of Russell's apartment. Before he went inside, he walked around and gave Angela a long hug, and then when Angela climbed back inside of the car with Anita, Anita looked at her and just rolled her eyes. Anita had had a great time that evening, but more than once when Russell was dancing with Angela in the Rio room, Anita had definitely felt like she was just a third wheel. Angela just laughed it off and said Russell was a friend, and then they pulled away from the curb and kept on driving. By 1:15 a.m., Angela had arrived outside of Anita's dorm room. Angela had asked Anita to stay with her at her condo, but Anita had politely declined. The women hugged and said they'd talk tomorrow. Then Anita went inside of her building, and Angela hopped back inside of her car and then pulled away from the curb and began driving back home. But as Angela drove, she made a sudden decision to swing by Ben's apartment, which happened to be right on the way. Maybe if she just appeared on his doorstep, he might invite her to stay. But that did not happen. When Ben finally opened his front door looking totally groggy and disheveled, he was not pleased to see Angela standing there. After a brief chat, he told her that as nice as it was to see her, he really just needed to sleep, so could she please just head home and they could talk tomorrow. Angela would eventually accept defeat and would turn around and head back down the steps towards the street below. After Ben watched his girlfriend climb back into her car and drive off, he turned around and went back inside and climbed back into his bed. But just 15 minutes later, at about 1:45 a.m., right as Ben was finally dozing off again, he heard his phone ring. Groaning, he rolled over and picked up the receiver, already knowing that it had to be Angela, and it was. But this time, something was very different. She was not playfully trying to convince him to come see her. Instead, her voice sounded strained. Something was wrong. She was calling from inside of her condo, and her first words to Ben were both strange and distracted. "Ben," Angela said, "talk to me." And when Ben heard a sudden noise in the background and the sound of a voice calling out a question, Ben's anxiety flared. "Angie," he said, "are you okay?" Angela hesitated for a second, and then, still speaking in that sort of distracted and disjointed voice, she said, "I let a man into my condo." Before Ben could respond to this, he heard the sound of utensils clattering on the kitchen counter very close to the telephone, and Angela suddenly telling him in a rushed voice that she would call him back in just a few minutes before she suddenly hung up the receiver without even saying goodbye. By now, Ben was wide awake, and when a few minutes went by and Angela did not call him back, Ben dialed her number and got no answer. As he jumped out of bed and started pulling on his clothes, he called a second time, and again there was no answer. Now, Ben felt a flash of panic, and still pulling on his jacket, he ran outside and he jumped into his truck. Although portable cell phones wouldn't be a thing until the 1990s, as a construction supervisor, Ben's truck was equipped with a satellite phone. And as he made the 8 to 10 minute drive to Angela's condo, Ben used that satellite phone to call Angela's number again and again, but still there was no answer. Once Ben pulled into the parking lot of Angela's condo building, Ben saw Angela's car in its usual space. He parked his truck not far from her vehicle, and then he leapt out of his truck and ran to the stairs to Angela's front door, where he began to press her doorbell while also banging on the door and calling out her name. When no one answered or came to the door, Ben turned and ran back down the stairs and around the building to another flight of stairs that led up to Angela's balcony and where her back door was. When he got up to that door, he began banging on it and calling out Angela's name again. But again, there was no answer. Ben would eventually leave the back door and run back to his truck out front, where he would use his satellite phone to call 911. At 2:17 a.m., the emergency dispatcher who received Ben's 911 call sent a couple of officers out to do a welfare check at 4944 Amesbury Drive. The dispatcher told the police officers that a young man named Ben McCall was worried something bad had happened to his girlfriend, Angela Samoda, who lived at that address. When the two police officers arrived at the scene 23 minutes later, they found Ben sitting quietly on the back steps leading up to Angela's condo. To that point, the two responding officers had spent that whole night and the early morning hours answering lots of complaints of noise and drunkenness and disturbance, as all of Dallas seemed to be out on the streets partying. And so, tired and at the end of their shift, they were confident that this call would be no more serious than all the others they had been to so far. After directing Ben to go get the master key from the on-site building manager, the police officers walked around to the front of the property to knock on the door, and to double-check that the condo really was locked. It was locked, and after they knocked, no one answered, but a few minutes later, Ben arrived with the master key. With Ben waiting outside on the sidewalk, the police officers used the master key to open Angela's front door, and then they stepped inside. And almost immediately, the officers knew that this call was not like the others they'd responded to that night. On the carpeted floor of the living room just ahead of them, they could see there was a single black high-heeled shoe tipped over on its side, and near it was what looked like the track of another spike heel that had been dragged through the soft pile of the rug, like someone was still wearing that second high heel when they were dragged across the living room. After seeing this, both officers reflexively put their shooting hands down on their gun holsters. One of them, a rookie officer named Janice Crowther, who had just joined the Dallas police force 1 year earlier, immediately felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up when she saw those two shoes. Turning around and looking out the front door, motioning Ben to stay where he was, Janice turned back and stepped into the living room for a closer look, while her partner turned left and headed for what looked like a bedroom door. A minute later, as Janice was looking around the living room and not really seeing anything, she heard her partner calling out, "I think I found her." In the 31 years that Officer Crowther would go on to serve in the Dallas police force, she would never see a crime scene any more brutal than the one that met her eyes when she stepped into Angela's bedroom. Inside, Angela Samoda was lying on her back. While the upper part of her body was still on the mattress, her long, tanned legs dangled off the edge of the bed, not quite touching the floor. Her naked body was covered in blood, and it was clear right away that she had been the victim of an incredibly violent attack. The officers immediately rushed over to her and checked for a pulse, but Angela was deceased. After making sure the attacker was no longer in the condo, police radioed for an ambulance, crime technicians, and a team of homicide detectives. Within minutes, the street outside of Angela's condo, as well as her building's inside parking lot, became the scene of police cars and flashing lights as officers quickly cordoned off Angela's unit with yellow crime scene tape. 30 minutes later, lead detective Virgil Sparks and his partner Russell Graves were standing in Angela's bedroom looking at the ruined remains of a young woman who just hours before had had a vibrant life and a promising future. Their first impression was that this murder had been a crime of intense passion. In violent cases like this, where there was no sign of robbery, police knew from their experience that the motives were often rage, jealousy, love, revenge, or some combination of those. Detectives would need to wait for confirmation from the crime scene techs and the results of Angela's autopsy, but it certainly looked to them like Angela had been the victim of a violent sexual assault. And since there was no sign of forced entry, it also looked like Angela herself had opened the door to her attacker. From the defensive wounds on Angela's hands and arms, and the single high-heeled shoe that was still lying in the middle of the living room, detectives also surmised that there must have been a struggle and that Angela had likely tried to fight off her attacker. And from the smears of blood on the bedroom light switch and the bloody residue around the drain in the bathtub and on the bottom of the shower curtain, it also appeared that after killing Angela, her attacker had used her bathroom to try to clean themselves off before leaving the condo and taking the murder weapon with them. Feeling sure that the killer had to be someone who knew Angela, the first people that the police wanted to talk to were the men in Angela's life, starting with Ben. If it was true that Angela had called Ben at 1:45 a.m., when, according to Ben, she sounded distracted and in trouble, which had prompted him to go check on her at her condo, and given that Ben called 911 at 2:17 a.m., then the murder had to have occurred during those intervening 32 minutes. If the killer wasn't Ben, then that meant Ben had just magically arrived at the condo within minutes of the killer making their getaway. It just seemed too convenient for Ben. So the detectives believed Ben had to be involved, or at least know something about what happened. His proximity to the crime and connection to the victim was just impossible to ignore. 30 minutes later, Ben was sitting across from the detectives in the interrogation room at the Dallas police station. And the thing detectives noticed about Ben right away was his very unemotional response to what had just happened to his girlfriend. Ben just kind of sat there quietly as if nothing had happened. So when Ben again brought up the phone conversation he'd had with Angela at 1:45 a.m., when she sounded scared and she said that she let a man into her condo, the investigators were just not necessarily buying it. They felt like maybe Ben was making this call up. So the detectives focused their follow-up questions not so much on this call at 1:45 a.m., but on whether Ben had been jealous that Angela had gone out that night with Russell and not him, and whether maybe Ben was just angry because maybe he suspected that Angela had other men she was seeing romantically besides him. But Ben swore he had nothing to do with the murder, and even though he would refuse to take a lie detector test, he would agree to give blood and saliva samples, as well as scrapings from underneath his fingernails. He also agreed to let officers search his truck and condo and access his phone records. By later that same morning, police had 3 more names of possible suspects. Angela's sorority sisters had told them about a former boyfriend named Lance Johnson from Angela's hometown of Amarillo, Texas, who had once threatened Angela with a knife and who still called Angela wanting to get back together. The police also had the name of Joseph Patrick Barlow, the Southern Methodist University student who had been known to follow Angela around campus and leave notes on her car windshield, along with writing love poems to her. And then there was Russell, the young architect who had spent the evening with Angela and Anita, and who had asked Angela out on at least one date and had been stood up by her at least one time. But that afternoon, on October 13th, as police were getting ready to follow up with each of these men, they received a critical piece of new information that would change everything. The preliminary results from Angela's autopsy had come back, and she had indeed been sexually assaulted, and her attacker had left behind plenty of bodily fluids, including semen, which meant her attacker was a male. But a test of those bodily fluids showed something unique. It would turn out the man who attacked Angela was what's known as a non-secretor. A non-secretor is an individual, man or woman, whose blood type antigens do not show up in bodily fluid other than blood. In other words, their saliva or semen or other fluid secretions do not contain any markers of their blood type. Approximately 50 to 80% of all people are secretors, while 20 to 50% are non-secretors. And so, this information immediately allowed police to start ruling suspects out. Today, police use DNA testing to track bodily fluids back to an exact individual. But back in 1984, when Angela was murdered, this kind of rough sorting of suspects using information like whether they were a secretor or not was about as good as police were going to get. So, with the non-secretor news, coupled with bulletproof alibis, the list of suspects suddenly dropped from 4 names down to just 1. Not only was Angela's potentially violent and jealous former boyfriend, Lance, a secretor rather than a non-secretor, he was also asleep in his parents' house in Amarillo, Texas, on the night of Angela's murder. And although the student who had followed Angela around campus would turn out to fit the bill as a non-secretor, he too had a rock-solid alibi that ruled him out. That left 2 suspects, Angela's boyfriend Ben and Russell Buchanan. And while Ben had seemed very much like the #1 suspect, the search of his truck and apartment had turned up nothing, and phone records placed him far enough from the scene at the suspected time of Angela's death that police doubted he had the time to commit the murder. He also was eventually proven to be a secretor. Russell, on the other hand, was a non-secretor, and he had been with Angela right before she was killed, and his apartment was only a 5-minute walk from her condo. But what really snagged the police's interest in Russell was the fact that when investigators went to his apartment to interview him on October 13th, just hours after Angela's body had been discovered, Russell was nowhere to be found. In fact, it wasn't until Monday, October 15th, more than 48 hours after Angela's murder, that police finally found Russell at his home. And when Russell answered their knock on his door, he found a shotgun pointed directly at his chest. It wasn't exactly a raid, but it was clear to Russell that he was in some serious trouble. With the shotgun still aimed at his chest, detectives ordered Russell to go with them to the police station to answer questions about the murder of Angela Samota. Once they were in the interrogation room, Russell told the detectives that he had nothing to do with Angela's murder. He said he didn't even know she had been killed until the police were at his door that morning with a shotgun pointed at him. He said the last time he saw Angela was when she and her friend Anita had dropped him off at 1 a.m. after the three of them had left the club. He told police that he was never involved romantically with Angela and that he knew she had a boyfriend and he was not jealous. When asked why he wasn't around on the 13th and 14th, Russell said he'd been at a wedding in Dallas before flying to Houston, Texas to visit his parents, and he had only just gotten back late on the 14th. Russell's story seemed plausible, but he didn't really have an alibi, and he was a non-secretor, so investigators could not rule him out as a suspect. However, without any other hard evidence that actually linked Russell to the crime scene or to Angela's death, Detective Sparks and Graves had to let Russell go. Over the next few weeks, 6 investigators, who were all assigned full-time to Angela's case, chased down every lead they possibly could. They interviewed everyone from friends and family to the mechanics who worked on Angela's car to the workers who had installed the carpeting in Angela's condo. But no one had any useful information. Crime Stoppers, a community program that encourages people to provide anonymous tips about crimes, featured Angela's case in a televised program and even offered a reward of $1,000 for any useful information. Also, Angela's own family offered a reward of $10,000 for information that would lead to her killer. But still, nothing came in. And as every lead seemed to go cold, Detective Virgil Sparks couldn't help but keep coming back to one name on his suspect list: Russell Buchanan. Russell had not been ruled out yet, and in Detective Sparks' eyes, Russell just seemed like the guy. And soon, one of Angela's friends, Sheila Gibbons, would become Detective Sparks' unlikely ally in his effort to uncover incriminating evidence against Russell. 22-year-old Sheila Gibbons was especially traumatized by Angela's death. Not only were the women both members of the same sorority, but also Sheila had been Angela's roommate during Angela's first year at Southern Methodist University. When they first met, it had seemed like the two girls did not have much in common. Sheila struggled with dyslexia, a learning disability that made it hard for her to correctly interpret words. And so while Sheila struggled with her studies and preferred socializing to books, Angela was the opposite. But over time, these differences actually seemed to draw the girls closer together. Sheila made sure that Angela didn't just study, and Angela helped Sheila focus on schoolwork. Even after Angela had moved into her own condo off campus, the women had remained very close. And just 1 week before Angela's murder, the two of them had had one of their regular get-togethers to catch up and chat about what was going on in their lives. On the weekend that Angela was killed, Sheila had been away from the university visiting her mother in North Texas, and that was where she was when she got a call from one of her sorority sisters who broke the terrible news. Sheila was completely devastated, and as soon as she got back to the campus, she went straight to the Dallas police station to see if there was anything she could do or tell them that would help in their investigation into Angela's death. And it was there at the station that Sheila happened to look over and see some of the crime scene photos of Angela right after she had been raped and murdered. And it was a sight Sheila could just never forget. After speaking with Detective Sparks and getting the impression that he was especially suspicious of Russell, Sheila offered to arrange and record conversations between herself and Russell in hopes that Russell might tell her something incriminating. And on top of Sheila spying on Russell, police also set up 24-hour-a-day surveillance on Russell, and they also pulled him in for questioning on dozens of occasions, picking him up at his work or at his apartment or anywhere in between. But all of that came to a screeching halt in April of 1984 when Russell hired a well-known defense attorney who told police they had to either charge Russell with a crime or leave him alone. And because at that point police still had not unearthed any hard evidence against Russell, they were forced to just leave him alone. And so Russell became yet another dead end. And by the late spring of 1985, the Angela Samota murder investigation had basically gone ice cold. And around the same time that investigators set Angela's files aside and changed the status of her case from active to suspended pending new information, Angela's friend and Detective Sparks' unofficial spy, Sheila, really started to struggle. Angela's unsolved killing had shattered Sheila's sense of safety and security, along with her belief in the justice system. Convinced that Russell had just gotten away with murder, and still feeling totally traumatized by the brutality of her friend's murder, Sheila would drop out of Southern Methodist University in the middle of her senior year. For a while after she left school, Sheila just sort of drifted through her life, overwhelmed by the sense of numbness that Angela's murder had caused. Eventually, in 1986, Sheila would meet a man named Charles Wasaki, they would get married, they would buy a house together, and they would have kids together. And for the most part, Sheila was able to just kind of focus on her family and move on with her life and not let Angela's murder dominate every aspect of it. But all of that would change one evening in 2004. By then, Sheila was 43 years old and was living comfortably with her family in Nashville, Tennessee. And while she did still periodically think about her friend Angela, the thought of what happened to her was still so traumatic that often whenever Sheila thought of Angela, she tried to bury those feelings and not talk about them. But one night that year, as Sheila was sitting up in her bed alone, trying to complete some homework for a Bible study class, she happened to look up from her Bible, and what she saw at the foot of her bed shocked her. Standing there was her dead friend, Angela Samota. According to Sheila, Angela looked exactly as Sheila remembered her. From the clear blue eyes to the huge smile that used to light up the room, her friend was dressed in the same brown sweater and matching brown skirt that she had been wearing the last time she and Sheila had gotten together at Southern Methodist University to catch up on each other's lives. Even though Angela would vanish just a moment later, Sheila described that experience of seeing Angela standing there as a, quote, God nod, a message not from Angela, but directly from God, that it was time for Sheila to get out there and make sure Angela's murder case finally got solved. As Sheila lay there in bed, stunned by what had just happened, she thought back over all the advances in DNA testing that had been made over the last 20 years, and how every day it seemed like more criminals were being identified through the genetic traces they left behind, from their fingerprints to a stray hair or a drop of blood or saliva or semen. And so as she sat there, her sense of shock quickly gave way to a clear sense of purpose. She put her Bible down next to her, and then she reached over to the table and she grabbed the phone off the nightstand. A moment later, she was talking to an officer at the Dallas Police Department, asking to speak with the detective in charge of investigating Angela Samota's murder. And even though that call didn't net her any new information about the murder, that didn't stop Sheila from pursuing this God-given mission to solve her friend's murder. Over the next 12 months, Sheila would call the Dallas police station 781 times to request they do DNA testing in her friend's case to try to figure out who her killer was. But each time, the request was denied because the case was still cold, there were no new leads, and at this point, they didn't even think they had the original crime scene evidence anymore to test. And even if they did, DNA testing was very expensive, and for a case this old, it didn't seem worth it. Finally, after those 781 calls didn't work, Sheila decided to just get a private investigator's license. This way, she would have the professional credentials that would force the police to take her and her requests for DNA testing seriously. And in 2006, 2 years after Sheila had seen the vision of Angela in her bedroom, she finally started seeing real progress on Angela's case. That year, the Dallas police finally established a cold case department, and largely because of Sheila's rabid insistence over the years that they look into Angela's case, the first case this new department pulled for re-examination was Angela's. That year, working directly with Sheila, the detective handling Angela's case was able to track down the original physical evidence that had been collected at the crime scene, and they sent it off for DNA testing. Once the DNA analysis was finally completed, the results were entered into the Federal Bureau of Investigation's database of known and suspected criminals, but there was not an immediate match. However, investigators would continue to search that database, and finally, 2 years later, in 2008, Sheila got a call from the Dallas police saying they had found a match, meaning they had finally discovered who killed Angela. And when they told Sheila who the killer was, she could not believe it. Based on the DNA analysis, along with other pieces of evidence and testimony, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Angela Samota. Back on the night of October 12, 1984, when Angela and her friends Anita and Russell were going from restaurant to restaurant and bar to bar having a good time, it didn't take long before Angela was drawing lots of admiring glances from men who were also at all of these establishments they were going to, especially when she and her friends stepped out onto the dance floor. Unlike a lot of the people who were out celebrating that night, Angela was drinking very little alcohol. As a result, her smile was genuine, her eyes were clear, and her movements were graceful and coordinated. The man who was sitting at one of the bars that night could hardly take his eyes off of this beautiful young woman in the black jumpsuit. And when Angela accidentally brushed up against him on her way to a table in the corner of that bar, this man felt a sudden thrill at the silky touch and warm scent of Angela's bare skin. It was then that he decided to follow her. He told himself that he just wanted to watch her, enjoy how good she looked, maybe just see where she lived and whether the boy she was with was also her boyfriend. So when Angela and Anita and Russell left the Nostromos Club at about 12:30 a.m., this man was waiting for them. He was standing just outside the exit to the club, maybe a few feet off to the side, so as not to be too conspicuous. Although this man was over 6 feet tall and weighed nearly 260 pounds, so he was enormous, and so trying to remain anonymous had always been a big challenge for him. But luckily, that night, the street was so crowded with drunk people that he hoped this beautiful girl and her 2 friends would not notice him. And when Angela and her friends emerged from the club, they didn't. They just walked right past him without a second look. The big man waited a few seconds to let them walk a little bit farther into the crowd, and then he put his hands in his pockets, he put his head down, and he began secretly walking behind the 3 friends. The trio would push past the big crowd out into the street, they would cross over to the other side, and they would make their way to the parking lot where they climbed into Angela's Toyota Supra. By the time Angela had turned her car on and began backing out of her parking spot, the big man who had followed them was now sitting only a few spots away in his idling vehicle. As Angela put her car into gear and began driving out of the parking lot, the big man put his car into drive and then eased his foot off the brake and slowly hit the gas. It wasn't long before the big man felt another thrill. At the first stop Angie made, that was the name he'd overheard her friends call her, the young man who had been with them got out. He hugged Angie and then made his way into the nearby condo building. Meaning, even if that young man was Angie's boyfriend, he wasn't going to be spending the night with her. A few minutes later, the big man could hardly contain his excitement when Angie stopped again, this time at a college dormitory where she said goodbye to her other friend, the girl. Angie was now all alone. But the big man's smile faded when Angie's third stop took her to an apartment where she knocked on the front door. This couldn't be her own place, or she would have just used a key and walked in. A minute later, an outside light switched on, and the big man saw another young man open the door, and a moment later, Angie had stepped inside and the door had shut behind them. So that was it, the big man thought, at least for tonight. That young man who had just opened the door must be Angie's real boyfriend, and she is going to spend the night with him. The big man suddenly realized how tightly he was gripping the steering wheel, and he took a few minutes to force himself to just breathe and relax. But even as he was getting ready to turn his car back on and drive home, the door to this apartment opened again, and he saw Angie step back outside, her blonde hair shining like a halo in the porch light. Watching intently from his car, the big man held his breath, then let out a sigh of relief when the young man inside the apartment stepped back inside and closed the door. Angie was alone again. Breathing a little faster now, the big man in the car watched as Angie walked back to her Toyota. She unlocked the door, slipped once more behind the steering wheel, turned on the engine, and pulled back out onto the road. She never noticed the car that pulled out behind her and followed her the rest of the way home. 10 minutes later, Angie was climbing the steps to her condo on Amesbury Drive. The big man had parked his car on the other side of the street and made a mental note of which unit was hers. He had made up his mind. He was going to go inside. But it was important that he got to her right now before she was settled in her bed. So, after taking a deep breath, the big man looked around him to make sure no one was watching. Then he climbed out of his car, he shut the door quietly, and began walking across the street toward Angela's building. Once she was inside of her condo, Angela put down her purse and hung up her car keys. But just as Angela was about to slip out of her black high heels and head for the bathroom, she heard a sudden but quiet knock on the door just a few feet away from where she was standing. Then she heard a man's voice and more knocking, still quiet but insistent. Whoever was out there sounded apologetic and kind of embarrassed, and so Angela stepped closer to the door and just listened. The man outside began talking again. He said he just needed to find out where the nearest payphone was. He'd just take a second or two of her time. Please, could you just open up the door? Reassured by the tone of his voice, Angela reached out and she unlocked the door. But then, before she could even turn the door handle, the man outside had pushed the door open himself and was now stepping into her condo. Forced backward, Angela felt a sudden rush of fear. The man in front of her was enormous, and he had these small, flat green eyes and a thin mouth. And as soon as he was inside of her condo, he just started repeating his question about the payphone while also simultaneously turning around, shutting her door behind them, and locking both of them inside of her condo. Then, with the door locked, he turned back around and faced her and began slowly walking toward her while asking if he could use her bathroom. For just a second, Angela squeezed her eyes shut, trying to gather her thoughts and find a way to make him leave her condo. And then she thought of Ben. What she needed to do was call Ben. This huge man would never hurt her if he knew that she'd told her boyfriend that he was here in the condo with her. So, as Angela forced herself to open her eyes and face the big man who was bearing down on her, she also reached out for the phone on the kitchen counter and quickly punched in Ben's number. The man didn't try to stop her from using the phone. He just continued walking closer and closer to her while asking, "Where's your bathroom? Where's your bathroom?" With the phone up to her ear, Angela quickly gestured to the intruder with her other hand toward a tiny hallway on the other side of the living room where the bathroom was located. As the big man suddenly turned away from her and began striding toward that hallway, Ben answered Angela's call. Right away, Angela began speaking, doing her best to stay calm, but her voice sounded strange and disjointed. "Ben," she said, "talk to me, please." And in the seconds that followed, Angela kind of awkwardly explained that she had just allowed a man into her apartment, and he's using the bathroom, and he's asking about a payphone, and did Ben know if there was a payphone near her condo? Maybe if the intruder knew where the payphone was, he'd just leave. But before Angela could explain anything else, the big man emerged from that hallway near the bathroom and strode right back over to Angela and again began asking her over and over again, "Where's your bathroom? Where's your bathroom?" The big man was now so close to Angela that the only way to put distance between her and him was to hang up the phone and back up. And so Angela quickly told Ben she'd call him back in a few minutes, and then she dropped the receiver onto its cradle. But before Angela could step away, the big man had taken one of the knives out of her butcher block on the kitchen counter, and even as Angela tried to turn and run toward the front door to escape, the big man lunged and he grabbed her with one arm around the waist and began pulling her away from the door. Angela did her best to fight back, but her attacker was way bigger and stronger than she was, and so a moment later she was being forcibly dragged across her living room towards her bedroom. After throwing her onto her bed, the big man climbed on top of her and then pressed down hard with his left hand over her mouth and face to stifle her screams. Then he violently raped her. After he was done, with his hands still pressed down over her mouth, he straddled her torso with one knee on either side of her, making sure she couldn't move. Then, with his free right hand, he reached over and he grabbed the knife he had taken from the kitchen that was sitting on the bedside table. Then, while staring straight down at Angela's wide eyes, the man raised the knife in his right hand over his head, and then he brought it straight down with all of his strength into the center of Angela's chest. Angela tried to buck him off, but seconds later he had pulled the knife out of her and then drove it back down again into a new spot in her chest. And he would do this over and over and over again, 18 total times. The force of these blows were so great that they broke Angela's breastbone, and even though the knife may have been as short as 2 inches long, it would go straight through Angela's heart and then come out of her back. And every time this huge man who was crouched over her like a monster raised the knife again to strike, a spray of blood left a thickening trail on the headboard and wall behind Angela and coated her face and body with droplets, except where the killer's left hand covered her mouth and where his enormous body covered her bruised and naked skin. Janice Crowther, one of the police officers who first discovered Angela's body early in the morning of October 13, 1984, would later testify at the killer's trial that when she first walked into Angela's bedroom, it looked like Angela's heart had been cut out and was laying on top of her chest. It would turn out Angela's killer was a 36-year-old convicted serial rapist named Donald Bess, who had targeted Angela simply because he liked the way it felt when she accidentally bumped into him at the bar. That was all it took. Angela didn't know him, and he didn't know her. Angela was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Donald was already an experienced predator when he first came in contact with Angela. He'd gotten out of prison on parole just 6 months earlier in March of 1984 after serving only 6 years of a 25-year-long sentence for rape, kidnapping, and aggravated assault. Although he was living and working in Houston, Donald had made the 240-mile drive north to Dallas several times that summer and fall to visit friends and to meet women at local bars. 9 months after getting away with the rape and murder of Angela Samoda, Donald would go on to rape, but not kill, yet another Texas woman. However, this time he was caught, and in 1985 he was sentenced to 999 years in prison, however, again with the possibility of parole. But in April of 2008, the DNA testing that Sheila had wanted the Dallas police force to do for so many years finally paid off when the DNA at Angela's crime scene matched Donald Bess's DNA. On June 18, 2010, Donald Bess was convicted of capital murder in the rape and stabbing death of Angela Samoda, and he would be sentenced to death. Now 74 years old, Donald is still on death row at Polunsky Prison in Livingston, Texas. While there is no execution date as of now, Donald will never be eligible for parole. As for Sheila, when she finally heard the name of Angela's real killer back in 2008, she was shocked. For more than 20 years, she had completely believed that Angela's killer was Russell Buchanan. In February of 2012, Sheila met with Russell in Dallas to apologize for her attempt back in 1984 to connect him to Angela's murder, and her belief in the years that followed that he was the guilty party. Now a well-known and successful architect in Dallas, Russell was quick to forgive. In the end, Sheila's persistence had not only led to the discovery of Angela's real killer, but it had also finally lifted the cloud of suspicion Russell had been living under for more than 2 decades. Sheila is still a practicing private investigator. Her specialty is cracking cold cases. Located in the middle of America is a little town called Hartford, Wisconsin. Downtown, they have the biggest automobile museum in all of Wisconsin. They also have a bowling alley called Dave's Lanes, which sells cheap beer and the best frozen pizza in town. Around the corner from the museum and Dave's Lanes are 2 other very popular local spots. One is called Scoop DeVille, which is an ice cream parlor that's themed like it's the 1950s, and they specialize in raspberry sundaes. And the other popular spot is called the Mine Shaft, and it's this big family-friendly restaurant that offers comfort food and arcade games. On warmer days, you can find residents of Hartford out on the many walking trails of Woodlawn and Willowbrook, which are 2 big, very well-maintained parks that are right outside of the downtown area. And on virtually any day, whether it's warm or cold, you can find Hartford residents packed into the Shower Arts Center, which is a local theater, to watch the local theater troupe perform. But none of these attractions are why anybody knows about Hartford, Wisconsin. The reason we know about Hartford, Wisconsin is because of Jesse Blahit. Jesse Blahit was a miracle. She was born just outside of Atlanta, Georgia in 1994 to her loving parents, Buck and Joy Blahit. And Buck and Joy, for the longest time, they couldn't have kids. In fact, they were kind of adjusting to their reality that they would not be able to have biological children when Joy discovered she was pregnant. The couple couldn't believe it. It was like the most incredible thing that either of them had ever experienced. Joy would give birth to Jesse at home with no drugs, no doctors, just Buck, his mom, and a midwife. And when little Jesse poked her head into the world for the first time, Buck and Joy fell instantly in love with her. Not long after Jesse's birth, the Blahit family would leave Atlanta, Georgia, and move to Hartford, Wisconsin. And it was there, inside of their modest 2-story home, about 5 minutes drive from the downtown, that Jesse would grow up. And it was also inside of that modest 2-story home where many years later, Jesse would come face to face with a monster. Jesse was always someone the other kids looked up to. She was a brilliant musician who could sing, and she could play the piano and the violin. One of her very close friends growing up, a girl named Jacqueline Knights, said that whenever she went over to Jesse's house, she would walk in and have to yell at the top of her lungs just to get Jesse's attention because Jesse was permanently playing the piano. But Jesse's musical talents were not the only reason people were attracted to her. From a young age, Jesse became outraged by bullying and unfairness of any kind. And so very quickly, she developed a very strong moral compass. She became a fierce defender of animal rights, environmentalism, sustainability, social justice, and ultimately ending violence against women. By the time she graduated from high school in 2012, Jesse had become very popular amongst her peers and also amongst teachers and parents. Jesse just came off as someone who was wise beyond her years. Jesse always talked about wanting to change the world, and after high school, she kind of figured out how she was going to do that. She decided she would study to become a choir director for either a university or a high school, because through that role, she would be able to teach and mentor upwards of 100 young lives every single year. So in the fall of 2012, Jesse would leave Hartford and head off to the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, which is about an hour southeast of Hartford, and there she would enroll in their musical education program. And during that first year at the school, Jesse did so well in that program that she was offered a talent scholarship for the following year. After wrapping up her incredibly successful freshman year in college, Jesse came back to Hartford, Wisconsin to live with her parents for the summer. Now, unlike other college kids that were back home for the summer, Jesse was not treating this break like it was a vacation. Instead, she decided she would just jump right into her musical education career. And so as soon as she got home, she started her own business, teaching voice and piano and violin to kids in Hartford. And within weeks of starting this brand new business, she had over 25 kids signed up. When Jesse wasn't teaching that summer, she was often writing original music with her friend Dan Bartelt, who was also a very talented local musician. Or when she wasn't doing that, she was rehearsing at the Shower Arts Center, where that summer she had auditioned for and landed a central role in that summer's musical, The Fiddler on the Roof. Jesse was the fiddler, and she was very excited about this. The musical opened to a packed house on Friday, July 12th at 7:30 p.m., and Jesse and the rest of her cast were incredible. And then the next night, July 13th, Saturday, they had another big performance at 7:30 as well. And then on Sunday, July 14th, they had a matinee performance at 2 p.m. After that matinee, Jesse and the rest of her castmates headed off to another cast member's house who had a pool, and they had a big pool party to celebrate the end of their opening weekend. And during this party, Jesse spent half of her time sitting around the pool with her castmates, and the other half of the time she spent petting llamas that were in a nearby field. Jesse would finally leave the party and get back to her parents' house sometime after midnight, and when she went inside, her mother, Joy, was still awake. And so when Joy heard her daughter, she came out to the front of the house, and she was getting ready to ask Jesse, how was the party, when she noticed right away that something was off about Jesse. She looked upset about something. And so Joy asked her, are you okay? And so Jesse looked like she was about to maybe go into a lengthy explanation about why she was feeling the way she was feeling. But ultimately, Jesse just kind of stopped herself, and in a tone that was less upset and more just annoyed, she would tell her mom, the guys in the cast, there are these two older guys that were kind of hitting on me, and those are my friends, and I felt like they were crossing the line, and it was just totally uncomfortable. And so Joy began asking some follow-up questions to get a sense of, how serious this was, and it just seemed like it wasn't that serious. And pretty quickly, the two women said goodnight to each other, and they both retired to their rooms to go to bed. The next morning, Buck and Joy got up fairly early, around 7 a.m., and Jessie, she stayed in bed because her only commitment that day was a lesson she was teaching one of her students at around noon, and they'd be coming by the house for that lesson. And so her parents knew she was sleeping in, and so Buck and Joy, they're kind of going about their morning routine. Buck left ahead of Joy, probably around 7 or 7:30, and then at 8 a.m., Joy, right before she left the house, she brought some laundry up to Jessie's room. And so she opens Jessie's door, she goes inside, Jessie's asleep, and Joy, she puts the laundry down, and she considers going over and waking her daughter up just to say good morning and maybe goodbye. But she thought to herself, Jessie never gets a chance to sleep in. She's always got something going on, and so I'll let her sleep. And so Joy just quietly left the room, she shut the door behind her, and she headed off to work. At around noon, Joy would leave her office and head back home for her lunch break. And so when she walked into her home, she was expecting to see Jessie awake because Jessie had one of her students arriving any time. But when she walked inside, the house was silent. Jessie was not downstairs. She apparently was not awake, and Joy had seen her car out in the driveway, so she knew she hadn't left. And so kind of annoyed, Joy walked to the foot of the stairs and she yelled upstairs for Jessie to wake up. Hey, your student's going to be here any minute. And then Joy left the foot of the stairs and walked into the kitchen and made herself something to eat. After a little while, as she's finishing making her lunch, Joy hears a knock on the front door. And now at this point, Joy is really annoyed because Jessie has still not made a sound. She has not come downstairs. And so Joy, she goes over to the front door, she opens it up, and sure enough, it's Jessie's student. She asks the student to come inside and wait for a minute. And then Joy hustles up the stairs. She goes right over to Jessie's bedroom. She opens the door up. Jessie's still in bed. And so Joy runs over to her to jostle her awake. But as soon as she is standing right above the bed, right over her daughter, and she has a clear look down at her daughter's face, she freezes. Moments later, she would call 911.
Oh my God.
Hartford 901, what's your emergency?
My daughter is blue. I went to wake her up, and I just got home from lunch, and she won't wake up.
She's
oh
19.
My God.
Okay, hang on just a second.
Okay.
Okay, so is she breathing?
I don't think so, no. Her pants are all wet, and she's got, it looks like strangulation marks.
There are strangulation marks?
That's what it looks like. I don't know what's going on.
Joy would gently pull her daughter out of the bed and lay her down on the ground. She would put a pillow underneath her head, and then she would begin doing chest compressions to try to save her daughter's life. But it was already too late. When police and paramedics arrived moments later, they came into the bedroom and they quickly determined that Jesse was deceased. When police looked at Jesse's body, they too saw the marks on her neck that her mother had referenced on the 911 call, and they also saw the same ligature marks on her left wrist and also on her ankles. As a result of these findings, the police on scene quickly concluded that this was not a naturally occurring death, this was not a suicide, this was a homicide. And so, as gently as they could, the police ushered Joy out of her daughter's bedroom and led her downstairs, because at this point, her daughter's bedroom was a crime scene, and they needed to keep it pristine so they could find evidence to figure out who did this. Once downstairs, Joy was reunited with her very distraught husband, Buck, who had just come home as well, and the two of them, their life is destroyed. Their beautiful baby girl, their only child, is now suddenly gone, and it didn't make any sense. During the search of Jesse's bedroom and then also the Blahit house at large, the police were not able to find any cord or rope or ligatures that could have been used to strangle Jesse to death. The police also noted that there was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house, and it appeared nothing in the house was stolen. And so quickly, the lead Hartford police detective named Richard Thickens began operating under the assumption that the killer knew Jesse and targeted Jesse. That they would have known where she was in the house, they knew how to get in the house, and they went straight for her, they killed her, and they left. When Detective Thickens spoke with Buck and Joy just hours after they had discovered their daughter dead, he asked them if they had any idea who would want to hurt their daughter. And at first, the parents said, no, we don't know anyone. But after some more prodding, Buck would say, well, recently there were some tree limb cutters that were cutting limbs right outside of Jesse's bedroom window. And so maybe they looked in and they saw a teenage girl who was all alone, and they came in and they attacked her. And then Buck also said that in addition to teaching music that summer, Jesse had picked up a few hours working at a restaurant down the road. And recently she had come into conflict with one of her coworkers who began acting very inappropriately with her. He basically would walk past Jesse and intentionally bump into her and rub into her and just get inside of her personal space. And this coworker was aware of the fact that Jesse was really upset and had already told her family. And so perhaps this coworker was disgruntled and was seeking revenge. Also, Joy would point out to the detective that the night before, when Jesse came home, she had seemed really upset about something. She had said it was about these two guys that, were hitting on her at the party, and it made her uncomfortable. But Joy and Jesse didn't really get into it. So there was something obviously on her mind the night that she was killed. Following this discussion, Detective Thickens would go out and track down those tree trimmers. He would also track down the co-worker at the restaurant, and he discovered that they had rock-solid alibis and they were ruled out as suspects. As for the two older guys, the cast members from the pool party that had made Jesse uncomfortable, Detective Thickens found them, and he very quickly ruled out one of them, but he was not able to rule out the other. His name was Randy Talley. When Detective Thickens spoke to Randy on July 15th, the day that Jesse was found, Randy would deny having anything to do with Jesse's death. When Detective Thickens asked him, where were you the night before after the cast party? Where'd you go? And then where were you this morning? Randy would tell him that after the party, he went back to his apartment, and that is where he has been the entire time until right then. When Detective Thickens asked him if there was anyone that could corroborate his story, Randy said no, he was alone in his apartment the entire time. Shortly after speaking with Randy, the police were still searching Jesse's bedroom for evidence, and they discovered her diary. And her final entry in this diary only made Randy seem more suspicious. Despite downplaying the incident that Jesse had had with these two older cast members at the pool party, After Jesse had spoken with her mom briefly when she got back from the party, she had gone up to her room and then made this final diary entry. And in it, she talks about being really upset about what these two guys had done to her. She said that these two guys were corrupting her and that they were taking what should be platonic love and perverting it into a competition. Her closing lines seemed to indicate that she might have been expecting some sort of future confrontation with these two guys. The lines read, "I am not helpless. I will recognize problems and confront them without fear. God be with me." Between Randy's lack of an alibi and then Jesse's kind of ominous final message that seemed to be talking about Randy, Randy quickly became the primary suspect in this murder investigation. But Randy's cell phone records indicated that he had not had any interaction, no calls, no text messages, with Jesse leading up to her death. And around the time in the morning of July 15th, when she would have been killed, Randy's cell phone was in his apartment, far away from Jesse's house. And so while this didn't definitively mean that Randy could not have killed Jesse, because he could have just left his cell phone at his apartment when he carried out the attack, what it did mean was there wasn't any real evidence to support the idea that Randy killed Jesse. And so the Hartford police had to go back to the drawing board and try to find new leads to chase down. And on July 16th, just 24 hours after Jesse was discovered, the police would get a huge lead. Before we finish our story, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Current. Banking is still one of the very few industries that has yet to be modernized by technology. It's still dominated by a bunch of old companies that, if given the chance, would happily sneak into your house and replace all of your good socks with the type of socks that immediately slip down into your shoe after only a couple of steps. But Current, even if they wanted to screw with your sock drawer, they couldn't. They don't have time. They're too busy being the future of money management. Current was built from the ground up with you in mind. They want you to get your money faster, move your money faster, and they give you tools to help you save your money better than ever. With Current, there are a bunch of perks, such as you can expect to get your paycheck 2 days earlier, you won't be charged overdraft fees up to $200, and there are no minimum balance fees. Also, Current's savings plan is one of the best available. It's just called Interest, and it offers a massive 4% APY, which in layman's terms means it will generate you 60 times more money than the American national average. So go download Current with my code, MrBallenMoney, and then request $500 from my Current tag, which is just Mr. Ballen, and include in your request your best like button gag. I will choose which ones I like the most, and I will pay those people $500, and we will feature some of the best suggestions in our next Current sponsored video. Again, the code is MrBallenMoney. Go download Current today. Okay, back to the story. 3 days before Jesse was killed, a young woman about the same age as Jesse, named Melissa Richards, decided to take her dog for a walk in a park in Richfield, Wisconsin, which is a small town about 10 miles southeast of Hartford. When Melissa pulled her car into the dirt parking lot that connected to the walking trail she intended to go on, she noticed there was only one other car parked in this lot, and it was immediately on her left, pointed nose away from the entrance. It was this blue minivan. And so as she's driving in, she looked over at it and she noticed the driver had their legs poking out of the driver's side window as if they were laying down across the front seats. And so this didn't really matter to Melissa, but she definitely took note of this person in this van. And so she drives past the blue van on her left. She drives all the way across to the other side of the dirt lot. She parks her car, she hops out, she gets her little dog Remy out of the car, and then she walks away from the parking lot and heads onto the walking trail into the woods. The trail that she was walking on was basically a big loop that ended at the entrance to the dirt parking lot. And so when she was done with her walk, she would be walking directly across the entire parking lot, which would mean she would be walking on foot past that blue minivan if it was still there when she was done. And so Melissa does a 30-minute loop. She gets all the way around and she reaches the entrance to the parking lot, and she sees the blue minivan is still parked where it was, except the driver no longer has their feet poking out of the window. Now she can't see if there's anybody in the van at all. And so Melissa, again, she's not really thinking about this. It's crossing her mind, but she's not on edge about this van. And so she lets go of the leash of Remy, and Remy starts running to the car, and Melissa pulls out her key fob and she opens up the trunk to the car. And so Remy runs over, he leaps into the car, and then Melissa just continues to walk across the lot towards her vehicle. And when Melissa walks just far enough that she is past the blue minivan, she turns to look at it and she sees the person who had been sticking their legs out of the window, the driver, is now sitting in the passenger seat of the blue minivan. The door is open and this person is sitting there staring at Melissa. And so Melissa, she makes quick eye contact with this person and immediately averts her gaze. She doesn't want to be rude, and she just keeps on walking towards her vehicle. But again, she's not worried about what's happening with this van. She's just aware of this person and this van. But after averting her gaze, she hears the sound of someone running towards her from behind. And so she whips her head around and she sees the same person who was sitting in the passenger seat, the driver of this van, has run up to her. And as soon as she turned around to face this person, they came to a complete stop and they were just staring directly at Melissa. They were only about 10 feet apart. And Melissa kind of reflexively said, "Oh, you scared me." And then Melissa just turned her back on this person and continued walking towards her vehicle. And after taking only a couple of steps, once again, she heard the sound of this person behind her start running towards her. And immediately she whips her head around again and again. This person comes to an abrupt stop as soon as Melissa's looking at them. Except now Melissa knows something's not right. And worst of all, she looks down and in this person's right hand by their hip is a knife. A split second later, this person charges Melissa. They tackle Melissa to the ground. Melissa smashes down onto her stomach and she's pinned on her stomach. And this person, they attempt to stab Melissa, but Melissa fights back like mad. She turns over and she grabs the blade of the knife and she wrestles it away from her attacker, and she pulls the knife under her body and she puts it under all of her weight. And the attacker is so surprised that this has happened, they actually stop for a second before kind of reaching down and trying to yank the knife out from underneath Melissa, but Melissa is not letting it go. And so finally the attacker just kind of sits up on her back and says, "Can I just go?" And Melissa says, "No." But at that exact moment, the attacker leapt up and started running back towards the blue minivan. And so Melissa, she's not waiting around to see what they're going to do. And so she jumps up. She's still got the knife in her hand. Her hands are completely ruined. Melissa runs to her car. She leaps inside. She throws the bloody knife onto the floorboard of the passenger seat. After making sure Remy is in the car with her, she shuts the back hatch. She locks the doors, and then she turns around and she sees her attacker in the van peeling out of the lot driving away. And so Melissa is relieved, but she also just wants to get the heck away from where she is right now. She's totally alone. And so she fires up her car and she drives to the hospital. After getting 15 stitches to repair the 3 very deep cuts in her hands, Melissa was transferred to a recovery room where a man named Joel Klossing, who was a detective with the Washington County Sheriff Department, he came into the room and he took down Melissa's statement. Now, Melissa was very shaken up about what had just happened. She had no idea who this person was, why they attacked her. But despite being shaken up, Melissa had the most incredible memory of the event. She knew exactly what her attacker looked like, all the little details, and she knew everything about the vehicle, to include the fact that she knew it was a Dodge Caravan minivan. So she knew the exact type of car, and she guessed it was probably from the years 2000 to 2002. And so Melissa gives this incredible statement, and Detective Klossing, he goes back and he has a composite sketch made of the attacker. And then on this sheet that showed the attacker, there was a description of the vehicle and where it was located and some details of the case. And so Detective Klossing releases this sketch and the information to the media, and he puts it around town. And he's expecting someone in town to know who this person is because the description is so good. And someone would come forward. On July 16th, so one day after Jesse had been killed, a deputy from the Washington County Sheriff Department, he came forward and said, hey, I saw your flyer and I read the description Melissa gave about the type of vehicle this person was using, and I have seen that vehicle parked in the exact same spot in that park. I was there a couple of weeks ago. I saw it there. There was something weird about it. The driver was acting strange. And so I actually ran the license plates to see if there was some outstanding warrants or something going on with this person. But after I ran the plates, nothing came up. And so I kind of just forgot about it. But now I've read this description and I'm pretty convinced it's the same exact vehicle. And so I can pull those plates that I ran and we can see who owned that vehicle, and maybe it's a match. And so the deputy, he pulls up the information that he had pulled from the license plates of the van he had seen a couple of weeks earlier. And when they looked at the owner of that minivan, there was just no way they matched the description that Melissa gave. It just could not be the same person. And so briefly, Detective Clausing and the deputy believed that, okay, it was just some big coincidence that a very similar blue minivan was parked in the exact same spot a couple of weeks apart. But when Detective Clausing looked a little bit deeper into who the owner of that vehicle was, he would discover they had a relative that matched exactly the description that Melissa gave of her attacker. And so on the afternoon of July 16th, so one day after Jesse has been killed, Detective Clausing tracks down the phone number of the relative who looks exactly like the attacker, and he punches that number into his cell phone and he put the phone to his ear. At the same time, 10 miles to the northwest, Buck and Joy Blahit were hosting a vigil for their daughter in their home. And so all of Jesse's very close friends and family, they were all there in the living room, and they were sitting around in a big circle, crying together, grieving together, and then also sharing their favorite memories of Jesse. And so while they're all doing that, a phone starts to ring inside of the circle. And the owner of that phone, 19-year-old Daniel Bartelt, who was a very close friend of Jesse's and who had spent much of that summer coming over to the Blahit household to make original music with Jesse, he stands up and he walks quietly away from the group, and then he answers the phone, and it's Detective Clausing asking Daniel to come into the station to talk about Melissa Richards. Daniel would make his way to the police station that afternoon, and he would be interviewed by Detective Clausing and another detective. And even though they had brought Daniel in to talk to him about Melissa Richards, it was not lost on these detectives how strange it was that Daniel is at the home of a recently murdered young woman where that case is unsolved, and he is now the suspect of another attack on another young woman that happened only a couple of days earlier and only a couple of miles away. And so as soon as Daniel sits down, Detective Clausing kind of casually asks him, hey, why were you at Jesse Blahit's house when I called you? And Daniel would say, well, I'm very close with Jesse, and so we were there as part of her vigil because she was killed yesterday. And so the detective kind of did gradually shift to Melissa Richards, which Daniel would say he had nothing to do with. But as they began asking him questions about Melissa, Detective Clausing and the other detective noticed that there were cuts on Daniel's hands. And so they kind of cut him off and they asked Daniel, how'd you get these cuts on your hands? And Daniel was very quick to say, well, I got them at work. A screw kind of jutted out and cut my hands. I move inventory around in a back room of an engineering company. That's my job. And, I just cut my hand at work. And so at that point, the police began really asking very pointed questions about exactly how he hurt his hands and what exactly did he do at his job. And at some point, when it just seemed like there was something off about his story about how he hurt himself, one of the detectives just says to Daniel, if I were to call your employer, this engineering company, would they say you, Daniel, are currently employed with them? And Daniel, he kind of paused for a minute and then said, no, I actually lost my job several weeks ago. And so now the detectives knew he had to be lying about how he cut his hand because he's just told them that he hurt it at work recently, but he wasn't employed recently. And so Detective Clausing kind of leans in and says, Daniel, so how'd you really hurt your hand? And so Daniel, he begins talking about how he cut it cooking. And Detective Clausing is like, Daniel, nobody would lie about cutting their hand cooking. So why don't you just tell us the truth? And amazingly, Daniel would. he would admit, after some serious pressure, that he hurt himself attacking Melissa Richards. He told detectives that after he lost his job a few weeks earlier, he didn't want his parents to know he had lost his job, and so he had just continued getting up early and leaving the house and coming back later in the day, kind of acting like he had been at work all day, when in reality all he was doing was driving around town and sometimes going to parks and just sitting in parking spots in parks. And so on July 12th, the day that Melissa was attacked, that's exactly what Daniel was doing. He was pretending to be at work by sitting in that parking space in that dirt lot in Richfield, and at some point, he saw Melissa and he decided he just wanted to attack her. He told detectives that recently he had become overwhelmed in college, and so he had dropped out, and then he lost his job, and so combined, he was just feeling kind of scared of life. That's how he described it. And so he wanted somebody else to feel scared too, and so that was why he said he attacked Melissa. But despite admitting to this vicious, violent crime against Melissa Richards, Daniel, when asked if he had any connection to the Jesse Blahit murder, he would say, absolutely not. I love Jesse. I would never hurt her. But when Detective Klossing reached out to Detective Thickens of the Hartford Police and told them you should look at Daniel as a potential suspect in your murder case, it would quickly come to light that Daniel was lying again. Daniel was raised in a good, loving family. He was extremely smart, straight-A student. He was an incredible musician, and he was really well respected by his peers and even by his teachers and other instructors. I mean, this was a kid who had everything going for him. But something went wrong with Daniel, and no one knows exactly why. Shortly before he attacked Melissa, Daniel had become obsessed with killing and death and murder. His internet search history shows that he spent a lot of time looking for actual snuff videos online. Those are videos of actual murder. He also spent a lot of time looking up serial killers and spree killers, and he was especially interested in anybody who killed lots and lots of women. And then finally, right before he would attack Melissa, Daniel, based on his search history, had discovered this one particular pornographic snuff film, and it was of this woman who was all tied up and hogtied, and after being assaulted, she was strangled. And Daniel watched this video over and over and over and over again. On that day, July 12th, as Daniel is pretending to be at work, he's sitting in his car, he looks out and he sees Melissa, she's all alone, and something clicks in his head where he decides he's going to go reenact that wretched pornographic snuff film on Melissa. And so Melissa was likely just at the wrong place at the wrong time. Recovered in that dirt parking lot after the attack was this special, very strong tape that had been in Daniel's pockets during the attack. It had just fallen out. And so it's believed he was going to use that tape to subdue Melissa and then abduct her. But obviously Melissa fought back and Daniel got spooked and ran off. 3 days later, on July 15th, it's believed that Daniel decided he wanted to try again. He wanted to act out this pornographic snuff film, but in real life. And this time, he wasn't going to leave it up to some random victim. He needed his victim to be totally helpless. He needed his victim not to fight back. And who better than 19-year-old Jesse Blahit, his close friend who inherently trusted him and would easily let him into her house, into her bedroom. It wouldn't matter if she was all alone because she felt safe around him. Based on eyewitness testimony of someone who was driving through the Blahit neighborhood on the morning that Jesse was killed, it's believed Daniel arrived in the driveway of the Blahit household just a few minutes after Buck and Joy had left for work. And so he pulled into the driveway knowing that Jesse was all alone. We don't know exactly what happened inside of that house. We don't know if Jesse came down and opened the door or if she was still upstairs sleeping. But Daniel, he entered the house, and when he went inside, he was prepared for what he was about to do. He literally had a bag full of supplies. Things like that special tape, there were ligatures, cords, ropes, there was alcohol wipes, zip ties. And so he makes his way upstairs to Jesse's bedroom, and then once he's in there, we don't know if Jesse was awake or sleeping at this time, But either way, Daniel jumped on top of her and immediately put a homemade ball gag into her mouth and then wrapped that special tape around her head to make sure the gag stayed in her mouth. And then once she couldn't make a sound, he bound her wrists and her ankles and he hogtied her, and then he viciously assaulted her. And then after he was done, he wrapped some cord around her neck and he strangled her to death. After she was deceased, Daniel attempted to clean her body with some alcohol wipes, and then after that he kind of repositioned her in her bed with the covers up over her to give the appearance that she was still sleeping to her parents when they inevitably would find her. Then Daniel rounded up all of his murder supplies back into his bag, except he did accidentally leave one of those special rolls of tape underneath Jesse's bed, and then he slipped out of the Blahit household, and then he drove to Woodlawn Park, where he disposed of his supplies into one of the trash cans. The next day, at Jesse's vigil, Daniel would attend, and according to the other people that were there, Daniel was by far the most talkative person in that circle. Daniel would ultimately be found guilty of murdering Jesse Blahit, although he never admitted guilt. In fact, during the sentencing phase, Buck Blahit would give this incredibly eloquent and heart-wrenching speech about what it was like to lose his only child. And toward the end of this speech, Buck turned to his right, so away from the judge who he had been addressing, and he looked directly at Daniel. And Daniel looked back at him, and Buck says, "Dan, I forgive you as I have every day since I found out it was you." And then a few moments later, Buck would also say to Dan, "Dan, not only do I forgive you, but I love you." But when Daniel got his turn to stand up and say something on his behalf, he turned to face Buck and Joy, and looking right at them, he would tell them that he's innocent and that he doesn't have any answers for them because he didn't do it and his conscience is clear. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and as far as we know, he still denies having killed Jesse despite the mountain of evidence against him. In the days following Jesse's death, Buck Blahit walked into his daughter's bedroom and he laid down on her bed, and looking straight up, he tried to hold his breath for as long as he possibly could. And as he began to struggle, he started to imagine what it was like for his poor daughter in her final moments as she's being murdered, and it just crushed him. He thought to himself, "I wasn't there for my little girl when she needed me the most." But instead of just carrying that terrible burden around with him for the rest of his life, Buck and his family decided they had to do something to honor their daughter's memory and maybe even change the world, which was something that Jesse always talked about wanting to do. And so Buck would go on to start the Love is Greater Than Hate project, which is this incredible charity whose mission is designed to end male-on-female violence and to inspire love over hate. Buck's charity is a recipient of a MrBallen's Foundation grant, and if you have been moved by the story in some way, I would highly encourage you to contribute to Buck's charity. You can find the link to their website below where you can donate. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button to help you move out of your apartment and offer to pay them in beer and pizza. When they accept and the move is complete, only serve O'Doul's and anchovy pizza. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast called